Praise God. I was reminded, I read this accident form about an accident that really happened. What happened was the guy was a bricklayer. You guys remember that? He works on the bricks on the side of the house. He was working on a 6-story building. The building was 6 stories high. Now what he had done is he had laid the bricks all the way up, and he had gotten the bricks on top of the building. And it was 500 pounds of bricks. Now what did he do? He said, I got to get these bricks down from the top because I'm finished laying them. So what he does is he brings a bucket and pulls the bucket all the way up to the top, loads it full of 500 pounds of bricks. He has it sitting on the top. He goes down 6 stories, get to the bottom, has the rope tied with this 500 pounds of bricks. He decides to untie the rope, and he says, I'm just going to lower the bricks down real slow. That was his plan. He gets there, gets to the bottom, he unties the rope. Being that he only weighed 185 pounds, and he had 500 pounds of brick. Can you imagine what took place? The bricks began to come down rapidly, and he begins to go up rapidly. Now, on his way up, about the 3rd floor, he meets those bricks. That's how he broke his shoulder. That's how he broke his arm. He goes all the way to the top. The brick goes all the way to the bottom. His fingers get caught in the pulling. And he writes, that's how I broke my 2 fingers. But he still had presence of mind to hold the rope. So he's dangling 6 stories high. He pulled his fingers out, and the bricks that were at the bottom broke, went through the container. Now they're only about 50 pounds. Guess what? He comes down, and he meets those bricks on the way up. That's how he broke his ankle. That's how he broke his knee. So he falls and he lands on this pile of bricks. That's how he broke his back. Now he's standing there relieved, wondering, how in the world can all this happen to me? And he lets go of the rope. Guess what? That 50 pounds of brick in the bucket comes and lands on his skull. And he goes, that's how I broke my skull. Now, bad things happen to good people. They just happen. That was a true accident report, by the way. It just happened. Things just happen. And you can't get over it. Just things are going to happen no matter who you are, no matter what you do. You can write it down. Things are going to happen. Imagine what Joseph would have done. Joseph is trying to do right, but he ends up getting in prison for doing wrong. It wasn't anything he did. It wasn't because he had bad character. It was because he had good character. It was because he did everything right. That's why he got put in prison. Now, can that be said about you? Can you say that the reason they're persecuting me is because I have good character? Is that the reason? Is that the reason? See, he had to learn how to live in adversity and prosperity. This type of man had to learn. Now, look, I'm going to tell you about a guy named Peter Marshall. Peter Marshall says that he's a Britishman. And what he says is that God uses peaks and throws. He says throws, but in our English vernacular, it means valleys. He said what God uses is he uses peaks and valleys in order to push men and women through them, and what he does in order to conform them into his shape. And he says that he uses more valleys than he does peaks. That's what he said. Peter Marshall said he uses more valleys than peaks. But this is the reason. Peter Marshall said the reason that is he wants to shape us into the form of Jesus Christ. And he says it takes the valleys in order to be able to do that. He says that's how God does it. But listen, what I want you to understand is that even though God does this, Peter Marshall said God did this with some of his favorites. Peter Marshall said some of his favorites he took to the valley deeper and longer than anybody else. Now that's his favorites. And if you don't believe me, look at Joseph. Look at Abraham. Look at Moses. Look at Paul. Now if these are his favorites, and that's how God treats them, what about you? Now you can't say you've been through any valley as deep and as long as them. Now if you haven't, then you say if God will do that to his favorite, what will he do to you and me? What will he do with us? You see what Peter Marshall's right. So you can say, yes, bad things happen. Where is God when that? He's right there. because he's taking his favor through it. The fact that you're going someplace and you're wondering where God is and he's got you in the valley, that's a good thing. Because you're one of his favorites. That means he's taking you somewhere. That's what Peter Marshall said. But see, while you're going through it, I'm going to give you some things you need to remember. One is you need to remember the promises of God. That's what you need to remember. You need to remember God's promises. And let me tell you like this. Because Joseph, look, Joseph in the 37th chapter, he would go to his brothers. Remember, he had his dream. He went to his brothers and he says, look, I've had a dream that the sheaves are going to bow down to me. And guess what, Daddy? I had another dream that the stars are going to bow down to me. Joseph went to them and he said, look, God has given me a promise. He's told me that the rulers of the world will bow down before me and all the resources will bow down before me. Joseph said, that's what the promise God has given. And see, what you've got to do is you've got to remember God's promises that are for you. The ones that God has made for you when you just try to determine when you're going through the valleys. So you've got to remember those promises and then what God has said as well as what God will do. Because what happens was sometimes we want to look at our circumstances more than dwell on the promises of God. We'd rather look at our provisions and we'd panic instead of dwell on the promises of God. Now let me get it. See, what you'll go and you'll take inventory. That's what we'll take inventory. We'll look and say, I got a flour and I got oil. And I'll take inventory and that's all I have. And then we'll look at that and say, based on the provision, this is all I can do. We'll look at it and say we're limited on what we're doing because of the provision. So once we look at the provision, instead of dwell on the promises, that's how we get stuck. See, that's how we overlook God and we can't see God because we're looking at the provision that he's provided and that we have. I'm going to tell you, look, you remember Elijah? You remember the widow? You remember when she was going out picking up twigs? Reggie, all she went to get was, she said, all I got is flour and oil. She said, that's the only provisions I got. Flour and oil. And she would say, with my flour and oil, I'm going back to the house and I'm going to make one more cake for my son and I. And guess what? Then we're going to die. She said, that's what we're going to do. She said, because all I can see is based on what I have. She couldn't see beyond that. And see, so it becomes difficult. It becomes difficult for us when we're going through the valleys and we're wondering, where is God? It becomes difficult to focus on the promises of God because we've got our eyes on the provision. We look and say, this is all we have, so we assume that's all we can do. See, but Joseph said, this may be where I'm at today, but he understood that wasn't where he was going to stay because he remembered the promise. He said, the sheaves are going to bow down. The stars are going to bow down. So Joseph was remembering the promises more than he was the provisions. And see, you've got to be able to do that because God will take you and put you in prison at times. And it'll be in a prison. And what you can either do, you can either be in prison and have your personal pity party. That's what you can do. You can sit in prison and say, I'm going to have a pity party. Joseph could have done that. He could have sat in prison and said, I'm going to have my personal pity party. But no. Joseph, what he did was he said, I'm going to make this prison my personal platform of praise. And there's a difference. He decided not to make a pity party, but a platform of praise. Joseph said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to praise God even in the prison. Because it didn't matter to him because he understood the promises. See, but when you understand the promises, it'll be easy to praise God in the prison. Because you dwell on the promises and not the provision. And so what he was saying was, I dwell on the fact that God is going to do something, that he has something in store for me. And see, when you dwell on that fact and you understand that God has something in store for you, then it becomes very easy to walk through the valley. See, it becomes very easy to be able to go through because you're looking at the outcome. And see, and not at the situation. See, because you got to say the future is going to be bright. It'll be bright. I'm going to tell you about Justine. You guys may not know that, but he was a missionary in Burma. When he was over there in Burma, his whole thing, he was wanting to make converts. He was going over there missionary, he was trying to make people converts come to know Christ, Leon. And when he was doing that, and he was over there, all of a sudden, everybody that he converted, they began to kill the Burmese people. They began to kill them. Why would they? They didn't like what Justin was doing. They said, we don't like it, They began to kill him. Now what they did was they captured him. When they captured him, they brought him, they strung him up with ropes, stripped him down, beat him. They hit him over the head. They blooded his eyes. Matter of fact, his eyes became so big and swollen he couldn't even see out. Knocked his teeth out. He was just bleeding all over the place. And then they would tell him and hit him, and they would say, "Justice, how does your future look now?" This is a true story. That's what they would ask him. And they said while he was hanging on the ropes, with his head down, eyes closed shut where he couldn't see, he raised his head up and he told him, "My future as bright as the promises of God." And you're talking about in prison. You're talking about being persecuted. And you look up and you say, your future is still as bright as the promises of God. Now, look, well, I want to tell you that and tell you this, that your future is as bright as the promises of God. And God has made promises. He's made them to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He's made them to Moses. He made them to Simeon. He made them to Isaiah. He said, Isaiah, there's going to be a soon coming king. He told Simeon, you'll see the Savior before you die. He said, guess what? He's made promises to you and I. Number one, that he's coming back again. Number two, that we can receive our sin and salvation shall be forgiven through his son, Jesus Christ. Number three, that we shall receive eternal life. See, he has made certain promises. And so no matter what you're going through, when you see you're going through the valley, things you can look up and say, my future is as bright as the promises of God. See, your future is bright. Because you got to be able to see beyond just right now. See, so you got to remember God's promises. And then you got to rely on God's providence. Rely on God's providence. Listen, Joseph was in that jail. Dirty dungeon, and you know he was there. But you can't always go by your situation. Because it will sometimes deceive you. Yeah, see, regardless of what it looks like, you got to remember what God has promised you. See, and you got to rely that God's going to do what he says he's going to do. You got to rely on that. And see, even though regardless of what the situation looked like, you've got to move it. Because listen, Joseph was in there. He was in there for doing right. He wasn't in there for doing wrong. He was in there for his good character, not his bad. He was in there because he decided to do things the right way. And see, sometimes you go, I do things the right, yes. And you may have to go through the valley. Why? Because God takes his favorites through there. See, that's what he does. And see, you may have to end up going through it regardless. So regardless of the situation, you got to say, hey, I understand that I'm going to rely on God's providence no matter what. See, I'm going to lean on that regardless of the situation. So what happened was Joseph, then here we get him. He's now in this dirty dungeon prison and jail. All because he's doing what he should be doing. Not what he shouldn't. Now, I could understand if Joseph was in there because something he did, but he wasn't. And now he said, okay, it disrupts his freedom. He doesn't have liberty. And he didn't have liberty because he would not corrupt his purity. He did not have liberty because he wouldn't compromise his integrity. He didn't have liberty because he wouldn't cast away his dignity. See, because Joseph chose not to do any of those. Those are the reasons Joseph didn't have liberty. But I'm going to press to you that bad things happen to good people. I don't care who you are. Because we know that it's going to rain on you no matter what. So guess what? Things are going to happen. You can't get over it. Things are going to happen. Just put it up. And in that, you're going to ask, well, where is God? And in that, you've got to rely on the promise that God is going to do what he says he's going to do. Preacher comes back from a trip on a plane. As a layman picks him up. When he does, drives up. Preacher said, how's everything going? Layman said, well, preacher, not so good. He said, well, what happened? He said, while you were gone, a tornado came through and blew my house down. Blew it down to the ground. Preacher said, well, let me be honest with you. Michael, he told me it was just because of the way you've been living. He said, that's why they blew the house down. The way you've been living. The lady kept driving. He said, well, preacher, I want to tell you something. It blew your house down, too. Sometimes just bad things happen. Regardless of the situation. Doesn't matter who you are. It's not because you're living bad, not because you're doing wrong. It just happens. So you got to say, regardless of the situation, I'm going to rely on the providence of God. Listen, some things are not going to make sense. You're not going to be able to make sense of it. That regardless, you're going to say, hey, I'm trying to do everything you've asked me to do, and God, and it still pours down acid rain on me. God, it doesn't make sense when you're a tither and you lose your job. That doesn't make sense. You giving everything you have to God and you lose your job. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense when you're living right, eating right, doing all the things right, and you become critically ill. That don't make sense. You're going, God, I did everything you're asking me to do, and it doesn't make sense. You're going, I pray every day, God, I do all the things that, and guess what? Calamity is still in my life. You begin to get perplexed. I can imagine Joseph being perplexed. I bet he's going like this, I don't understand it. He's going, it doesn't make sense. My big mom used to tell me that. My big mom, she told me, she said, Tim, some things in life just ain't going to make sense. That's how she thought, ain't going to make sense. That's what she told me. She said, it ain't going to make sense. She knew that. I know she did. That's all right. She's my big mom. She can do it. And that's what she told me. And after living life, son, I have to agree with her. It doesn't always make sense. As a matter of fact, I go, man, big mama, you're right. There are some things I cannot even figure out. I cannot even understand. But in the midst of it, I have to understand that God has a purpose. God has a plan. God is working something out. And although it may not make sense to you, it might make sense to God. And that's all it has to make sense to. So if it makes sense to God, and maybe it doesn't make sense to you, then what you need to do is you need to go to God and petition God to ask him to help you keep your senses during this time when it doesn't make sense. See, that's what you need to do. You say, go to God, let just keep me sane during these times when things don't make sense. It's been said, in the middle of perplexities, when you don't know what to do, why to do, or how to do, it says the thing you need to do is you need to keep calm, keep steady, and keep patient. So when you don't know what to do, why to do, or how to do, you need to keep calm, keep steady, and keep patient. When you don't know what to do, why to do, or how to do, you need to keep calm, keep steady, keep patient. When you don't know what to do, why to do, how to do, you need to come on, say, well, keep calm, keep steady, keep patient. Why? Because what may be hidden from you is not hidden from God. See, it may be hidden from you, but it's not hidden from God. So then you need to keep calm, keep steady, and keep patient. Because during those times when your reasoning is grounded, your faith needs to be swimming. There are some things you need to understand. When all reasoning gets thrown out the window, you got to then be calm, be steady, and be patient. Because then you got to rely that your faith with God will be swimming. See, that's what you got to do. That's what Joseph did. Because over in the 50th chapter, he said, you meant it for what? Evil. But God, but God meant it for good. See, so during those times when you don't understand how to do, what to do, why to do, you keep calm, keep steady, keep patient. Well, because what is hidden from you is not hidden from God. It's not hidden from God. And if you can't learn to serve God in the prison, ain't no way he's going to take you to the palace. There's no way he's going to take you to the palace. Until you learn to serve him in the prison. See, until you learn to be grateful in the prison, then God can then take you to the palace. And it's during those times, see, when you're in your prison, you need to understand that all things work together for the good of those who love him. And who are called according to his purpose. See, you've got to understand. And so then you can rely on God's providence that he's going to do what he says he's going to do. You can remember his for his promises because God has promised you. And he said that there's a brighter future ahead for you. You can remember these things and rely on the promises of God. Yeah. But then listen, you can also rest in the presence of God. Oh boy, that was good to me when you can rest in the presence of God. Because you see, in Genesis, right here in this verse, in the verses number 2 and 3, he said the Lord is what? With him. In 2 and 3, he said the Lord is with him. Now, this is when he was in the palace. But then you go over to 23, what is it, 21, 23, it said the same thing. The Lord is with him. This is when he was in the prison. He said God was with him, both in the prison and in the palace. He said God was with him. And you know what? God is with you. God is with you. Whether you believe it or not, or whether you know it or not, or even whether it feels like it to you. See, sometimes we want to operate on that feeling, but I'm going to tell you, don't operate on that. See, that'll confuse you. That'll throw you out the window. You operate on the very fact of the promise. See, you operate on the providence. You operate on something tangible that God has said and God's going to do. See, and then you can say, I can rest in the fact of his presence. See, one of the things about a Christian you have to understand is that although it might get lonely, you are never alone. You're never alone. God is always there with you. Like Isaiah. You remember when he says, God is always, always there with you. Like Noah when he was in the ark. And the flood was coming. God was with him. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. When they were in the jail, when they were getting thrown into the fiery furnace, guess what? God was with them. When Daniel was thrown in the lion's den, God was with them. Guess what? God is with you. No matter what valley you're going through, God is there with you. And you've got to believe that. God is there with you. I don't care what it looks like and how the winds swirl and look. God is there with you. Don't go by your feelings. Don't go by the provision. Go by the fact that you understand that God is there with you. And he will be there with you. And believe me, the believer, when the flood comes, will never drown. The believer, when the flood comes, never drown. When the fire comes, he will never be burned. And you say, well, preacher, you just make that up. You just saying that. No. I want them to show you Isaiah 43. When they bring that up, what does it say? When you pass through the water, I'll be there with you. And go through the rivers, and they will not overflow. That means they won't drown you. And when you walk through the fire, I won't be burned. Now, you say, you made it up, preacher. No, I didn't. I'm telling you, Isaiah said it. So I didn't make it up. I'm just telling you what he said. He says, if you're a believer, you won't be drowned and you won't be burned. So no matter what you go through, you have to understand that you can rest in the fact of God's presence, that he will be there guiding you, shaping you, leading you. It is God's promises that will keep you, his providence that will share with you and guide you. Look, and then I will tell you, rest in God's presence because it will guard you. Every time. Every time. Then listen, then you got to respond to God with patience. You got to have patience. Then you're going to say, why? I'm going to tell you got to have patience. Because let me tell you this. When Joseph went to jail, you know how old he was? 17. 17 when he went to the prison. But you know how old he was when he got out? 30. Chapter 41 tells you that. He got out when he was 30 years old. That means he was in jail 13 years. You got to learn some patience when you're in jail 13 years. And then during that time, he never got bitter. He never held a grudge. He never got angry with people. He continued to serve God, love God, worship God. He continued to live for God. See, his living for God was not contingent upon his circumstances. It's not contingent upon his circumstances. Now, what about your living for God? What will it take for you to preach? What will it take for you to quit the church? What will it take for you to quit worshiping God? Quit reading the Bible? Now, what will it take? When you think about that, what will it take for you to quit? To quit praying? What will it take for you to just stop? For some, it's simply going to the palace and they quit. Once they make it to the palace, they quit. Now, you know what I'm talking about. Once they've been blessed, I don't need no more. I'm good. See, what will it take for you to quit? See, is your worship of God contingent upon your circumstances? Is that what it's contingent upon? Is your holiness contingent upon your health? Is your praise contingent upon your prosperity? As long as I'm prosperous, I'm praising God. What happens when it's not that way? What will it take for you to quit? What will you to take to throw in the towel and say, I'm done with it? I'm telling you, God sends you through those battles to shake you. Peter Marshall says that's what he uses. That's what he uses those battles, is to make you conform into his spirit. So don't be going around quitting your worshiping of God, because you got to do it in the present. And when you can do it in the present, God promotes us to the balance. That's what he does. He'll promote you up when you understand that. And see, I know you'll wonder, where is God in the midst of tragedy that happens? Where is God in the midst of everything that's going on? You'll wonder, where can God? Why doesn't he show up in the middle of my circumstances and in my condition? You'll wonder, why hasn't God responded? It's where your patience needs to keep. Because God doesn't work on your time. He works on his time. Remember, I told you, God is outside of time. And he doesn't operate on the timetables that we have. But whenever he decides to step in time, he's always on time. Always. So you got to remember that. And you got to remember. And when you go through the perplexities of wondering, where is God in the middle of all of this? Why hasn't God shown up? When you begin to wonder that, you need to ask yourself, what will it take for me to quit? Say, am I ready to quit? And I'm going to encourage you, don't quit, don't quit, don't quit, don't quit. Stay in there. And give everything you have. Pastor comes to. Automobile accident happens. Man and a woman. They're in it. They have a child. In the accident, they walk away. The child dies. Pastor comes to the house. Mother and father, you can believe they wouldn't grieve. They approach him and they said, where is God? Where is he? They said, with all of this tragedy and calamity, they said, I would have readily given my life for my child. They said, where? Pastor, can you tell us where is God? Where is God? You know, he responded. He said he's the same place he was when his son died. He said when his son died, he was the same place. But where is God? He's sitting on the throne. He's on the throne. With every situation that happens. And he's there taking care of his own. You and I. That hasn't changed. It didn't change from when his son died, and it doesn't change from whatever you're going through. God is still there on the throne, taking care of us, interceding on our behalf to the holy God for us. So when everything goes wrong and I'm the only one, you can count. Remember, God is there for your glory, for his glory, and your good. Working everything out for you.